Hello, listeners, and welcome to Day 4 of our 7 Days of Thanksgiving bonus episodes. I recorded these intros ahead of time, but if my Thanksgiving prep's going according to schedule, I deboned my turkey yesterday, brined it in the fridge overnight last night, and today I'll dry it off, salt it inside and out, and let it air dry in the fridge overnight tonight, making sure that skin gets nice and crispy tomorrow. In the morning, I'll stuff it with wild rice, carrots, apple, cardamom, and raisins, sew it back up into a shape that at least somewhat resembles a turkey, and then pop it in the oven. It was easy for me to run over to Stop and Shop and pick up a turkey that was probably processed by immigrants in a poultry plant in the southern Appalachians somewhere. But how did our ancestors get their Thanksgiving turkeys in an era before refrigeration? The clip you're about to hear is part of a larger episode about Brighton's history as a cow town, when drovers brought vast herds of cattle from Maine and Vermont to Brighton's stockyards and slaughterhouses, just like cowboys in the Wild West. As part of that larger narrative, we also discussed how in the fall, those drovers would switch over from cows and sheep to turkeys, driving flocks of turkeys on foot from northern Vermont to Brighton to feed Boston's appetite for Thanksgiving dinner.
What could be a more iconic vision of the Wild West than a cattle drive, perhaps as embodied by John Wayne in the 1948 film Red River?
You're going to Missouri with 10,000 head. I want you all to know what you're up against. We got 1,000 miles to go. 10 miles a day will be good. 15 will be luck.
That movie traces the heyday of cattle drives, as large herds from Texas ranches were driven to railroads in Kansas and Missouri in the years following the Civil War. You might not realize that a generation earlier, cattle drives were already regular features of the Boston area economy, and they all wound up in one place, Brighton, our own little Wild West. When the Brighton stockyards reached their peak in the 1830s and 40s, the term cowboy hadn't really been coined yet. Cattle drives were known as droves, and instead of cowboys, the men who worked them were called drovers. We begin with an article by David C. Smith and Anne E. Bridges in a 1982 issue of the Journal of the Agricultural History Society, titled The Brighton Market, Feeding 19th Century Boston. Droves in New England were relatively small, averaging approximately 200 per drive. Animals were branded or tagged in their ears. On the first day, a half-dozen men with long whips moved the cattle out on the road. For the remainder of the drive, 3 men would be sufficient. Dogs were not often used, even with sheep. A drive from Franklin County, Maine to Brighton usually took about 14 days. Maine was a primary source during many of the market years for beef cattle, sheep, and especially working oxen, milk cows, and animals used for stores. Its place in the beef cattle trade went back a very long time. The first drive south to Boston came as early as 1645. John Mason, one of the first proprietors, immediately began importation of Danish cattle when he began settlement in 1631. Heavy importations occurred through 1633. By 1645, the surplus, some 100 head, were driven south overland and were sold in Boston. This was the beginning of the drover trade. Newspapers were filled with accounts of droves, and persons living in Maine thought passing cattle in sheep droves an item of everyday life. 10 to 15,000 cattle each year were sent to Brighton before the Civil War. Occasionally disasters occurred, but basically, droving was a routine affair, as cattle were rounded up, driven to the nearest marshalling yards, usually at Clinton in central Maine for the majority of years. Some droves, especially of working oxen or young stock for stores, continued to travel overland until late in the century.
Even before the herds reached Brighton and the market was convened, drovers and buyers might meet in surrounding suburban communities and reach a deal, as seen in a report on the agriculture of Massachusetts, published in 1841. In times of a quick market, droves of cattle and sheep are often waylaid a day's or more journey from the market, and sales are effected without their reaching Brighton. Large numbers of the droves reach on Saturday night the resting places within such a drive of the market as is easily accomplished on Monday morning. At these places, the Lord's Day is too frequently desecrated by these premature negotiations, and the gathering of the droves towards the market proves many times a troublesome annoyance in the sober part of the community in the vicinity of the great avenues.
The Wild West-style antics of those involved in the cattle trade continued to annoy the sober part of the community, both in the suburbs and in Brighton. Drovers and cattle traders quickly became known for heavy drinking, high-stakes gambling, and occasional crime and violence. That 1841 agricultural report shows what an increasingly temperance-minded community thought of the drovers in their midst. The facilities for intemperance and gambling, which have sometimes existed at Brighton, have been dreadfully prejudicial to the drovers and others who visit there and are obliged to remain there or in the capital for some days, without occupation, for the return of the weight of their cattle. Young men coming from the interior with cattle for sale are often ruined by here being entrapped and laying the foundations of fraud and drunkenness. If there is a place in our community, Brighton is one, where the friends of sobriety should combine their forces in this great cause of order and humanity, and where the banner of total abstinence should throw its broad folds to the breeze. Along with falling victim to the temptation of drink and gambling, drovers could fall victim to real crimes as well. You may be thinking of the cattle rustling we've all seen in westerns, but where is the sense in stealing a herd that you then have to sell, when you can simply wait and steal the money that a drover got for selling the herd instead? Cattle trading was a cash business, and that cash attracted criminals. Smith and Bridges tell the story of one unfortunate cowpoke on the way home from the Brighton market. Drovers often carried large amounts of money and were sometimes the target of attacks. The most significant of these occurred in Waterville, Maine in 1847. A number of stories circulated about this event, but apparently a local doctor actually murdered a drover for his purse of $1,500. A ballad was later written about this. Founded in 1830, the Cattle Fair Hotel Corporation was the second corporation established in Massachusetts. The company was a large landholder in Brighton and owned two assets vital to the cattle trade in New England. The first were the Brighton stockyards themselves. The second was the large hotel, located between today's Market and Leicester Streets, that catered to the farmers, drovers, buyers, and other wheelers and dealers that came to the market. As described by William Marchione, the Cattle Fair Hotel, with its 100 rooms, grand ballroom, and great dining room, was the largest hotel in the Boston suburbs. The hotel's manager in the early 1830s, Zachariah B. Porter, later founded the Porter House Hotel in Cambridge, from which Porter Square and the Porter House Steak derived their names. Bostonians rode out along the Mill Dam Road, now Beacon Street, and Mill Dam Extension, Lower Commonwealth Avenue, to the cattle fair to avail themselves of the liquid refreshments available in its giant saloon, which was said to be the largest watering hole in New England.
Of course, cattle weren't the only livestock being bought and sold at the cattle fair in Brighton. There were also pigs, sheep, and poultry, all of which were also driven to Brighton on foot. Smith and Bridges introduce us to some of these other herds. Driving sheep was similar to driving cattle, although fewer people were needed to do the work. After about a day, sheep moved steadily, stopping to eat by the verge when they wished, then falling into line behind others who had walked along. Sheep droves were larger. 600 to 1,000 were often moved in a drove. Poultry was also sold at Brighton. Killed eviscerated birds, ducks, geese, chicken, and turkeys, were crammed into barrels and covered with salt. These birds were sold in the fall, especially as Thanksgiving became a significant holiday after mid-century. Drovers experimented with droves of live birds. Reports of turkey drives from Vermont and Maine are accurate, although the numbers of animals is unknown. Peter Gilbert of Vermont Public Radio describes how a mid-19th century turkey drive would have worked. Before railroads, the only way to get turkeys from Vermont to market in Boston was to walk them there. And that, throughout much of the 19th century, is exactly what Vermonters did, including Vermonters from the northernmost parts of the state. Townspeople put their birds of a feather together, and accompanied by wagons with camp supplies and tons of feed grain, They escorted as many as 7,000 birds at a time all the way to Boston. Drives of 3,000 to 4,000 birds were common in the 1820s and 30s. Historian Charles Morrow Wilson says that about 1,000 birds was the minimum necessary to make the 150 to 350 mile trek worthwhile. It was a long haul. The flocks could only make 10 to 12 miles a day, and at least one drover was required for each 100 birds. Boys scattered shelled corn feed in front of the birds so they would walk forward, while others herded from behind. Flocks might spread out for more than a mile, ranging in width from a few feet to 50 yards. To protect the birds' feet on such a long hike over rough terrain and November's frozen ground, Vermonters sometimes coated the birds' feet with warm tar. They lost about 10% of the turkeys to forded rivers, foxes, hungry farm families they met en route, and other perils of the journey. It must have been an eye-opening experience for a farmer or a drover from some far-off rural corner of New England to come into Brighton on market day. Suddenly they would find themselves in a bustling urban center, one that was free of the puritanical sensibilities of the Brahmin elite and its nearby neighbor, and one that was swollen far beyond its usual population with fellow traders. There were saloons to visit and cards to play, and of course cutthroat wheeling and dealing to engage in to get a fair price for your stock. In an 1841 notebook that he kept while living at the Brook Farm Agrarian Commune in West Roxbury, Nathaniel Hawthorne described his experience at the Brighton Cattle Fair. On arriving at Brighton, we found the village thronged with people, horses, and vehicles. Probably there is no place in New England where the character of an agricultural population may be so well studied. Almost all the farmers within a reasonable distance make it a point, I suppose, to attend Brighton Fair pretty frequently, if not on business, yet as amateurs. Then there are all the cattle people and butchers who supply the Boston market, and dealers from far and near, and every man who has a cow or yoke of oxen, whether to sell or buy, goes to Brighton on Monday. Most of the people were of a bulky make, with much bone and muscle, and some good store of fat, as if they had lived on flesh diet, with mottled faces too, hard and red, like those of persons who adhered to the old fashion of spirit drinking. Great round-paunched country squires were there too, sitting under the porch of the tavern, or waddling about, whip in hand, discussing the points of the cattle. There were also gentlemen farmers, neatly, trimly, and fashionably dressed in handsome trousers strapped under their boots. Yeomen, too, in their black or blue Sunday suits, cut by country tailors and awkwardly worn. Others, like myself, had on the blue stuff frocks which they wear in the fields, the most comfortable garments that ever were invented. Country loafers were among the throng, men who looked wistfully at the liquors in the bar and waited for some friend to invite them to drink. Poor, shabby, out-at-elbow devils. Also, dandies from the city, corseted and buckramed, who had come to see the humors of Brighton Fair. All these, and other varieties of mankind, either thronged the spacious barroom of the hotel, drinking, smoking, talking, bargaining, or walked about among the cattle pens.